Nobody can see.
Right. So we are looking at genetic variation over time, which is a very simple way of saying evolution. It's basically our definition for that there. So what is evolution? We have, as you guys saw in your video, a change in the heritable traits within a population across generations. As you guys probably remember, heritable means it's passed down through the genes. You can inherit it from your parent. A population is a segment of a species within a specific area. So you could say, for example, that ESUMS is a population of students, okay, or ESUMS is a population of people. It's one group within a specific area. So to kind of restate it in a different way, evolution is basically small genetic changes in a population that are passed down from parent to child. It's not a fast process. Normally, to see evolution in action, you really have to look at least 5 to 10 generations. Sometimes it can happen faster, sometimes slower. It really depends on what you're looking at. And the diagram on the right shows evolution that's been influenced by natural selection, just like pretty much everything on our planet. You can't have evolution without having natural selection, at least not here. So if we look, you can see this creature, Eusthenopteron. It's very fish-like. Panderichthyes. It's a little bit more slick, less fish-like. Tiktaalik, even more so. We have, you can see a shoulder blade and a few bones in the almost arm. Yeah, it's still a fin, but it's almost an arm. Acanthostega is able to do a push-up. Ichthyostega, same thing. So what is the oldest thing on this? The top creature or the bottom creature? Lamar? The bottom. Awesome. So the creature started out in the sea, and over millions of years of evolution, they slowly modified into the amphibians we would kind of think of these days. Does anybody still need this slide? You good? Okay. So natural selection is a process in which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. The key word there is by nature. There are things in this organism's habitat that are causing it to either pass down this evolutionary change or not to pass down this evolutionary change. So in essence, the habitat of a creature systemically either allows or denies creatures the ability to procreate based off of those random evolutionary changes. If you're comparing the two, you could see evolution as a random thing, natural selection as kind of what guides the randomness. Does anybody have questions on that? You'll see more examples in the next slides. And you'll have a break from writing. As long as you know it, that's all that matters. Yep, as long as you know it. It's completely up to you. Whichever one makes sense to you. There's a chair right here. You want to sit? right, so this diagram is just a graph. So on the left, we have fitness in the current environment. Raise your hand if you've heard the phrase survival of the fittest. Good. So in a way, that's kind of describing natural selection. It's just not always describing it in the way we think of it. So when you hear survival of the fittest, can anybody give me an example of what you think of, Ashley? Eat or be eaten. Very good. Okay. Anything else? Okay, the food chain, food web, Lamar. What is it? Life or death. I thought you said Left 4 Dead for a second. I was very confused as to how the video game was brought into this. Okay, life or death. Okay, so essentially, if we're talking survival of the fittest, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the biggest, strongest, whatever, most dangerous animal that's going to survive. It means that whichever one is best suited to the habitat will be most likely to survive. Fittest just means which fits best in the environment. So if you try and take, let's say, a desert plant and try and grow it in a tropical environment, you're probably not going to have the best luck. Okay, Stephanie. Okay, you good? All right. So what we're looking at is fitness just means that it fits in the environment. It works in the environment. The environment and the organism work together very well. And the environment includes anything else that lives in that same area as that species or as that organism. So with natural selection, the creatures who, because of random evolutionary change, are most fit to their environment are going to procreate the most. They're going to have the most offspring. If you have the most offspring in comparison to creatures with other adaptations that don't quite work out as well, then those traits are going to be passed down. So whoever procreates the most passes down their genes the most. Does that make sense to you guys? And that's kind of how natural selection works. It's just whoever can have the most babies passes down their genes the most, and that's how the species is determined. Yeah? You good? Does that make sense? Okay. So here's another diagram. So you start out with overproduction. Every species tends to produce more individuals than can survive to maturity. Pretty much, that's just how it is. People will just any organism will basically procreate, will have more babies, even if there's not really anything around to make them survive. With what? Can't really do that unless you're acting humanly and killing off another gender. We'll talk about it later. Okay, so let's think about how many of you have seen a deer in the past 5 years? That counts. Deer overpopulation is a huge issue up here in the Northeast in particular. In Philadelphia, the city of, not the area, the city of Philadelphia, they have a huge deer overpopulation problem to the point where there are more deer that are being born, but there's no food. They are mostly restricted to the parks, as you would expect. So kind of like, East Rock and West Rock Park probably have a few deer in them somewhere. Okay, same thing in Philly. There's a big park that's kind of a gigantic version of West Rock, and there's tons of deer. If you go on a hike, you're probably going to see 2 or 3 deer. And a lot of them are absolutely emaciated. They're clearly starving. They don't have enough food. So those ones are going to die off. Those ones that are more sensitive to infection or more sensitive to, let's say, different types of disease are going to die off first. And that's all due to genetic variation. Which ones are going to be more, strong against different immune problems? Which ones are going to be able to live with less food? So the ones that don't survive have been selected against. The ones that do survive have been selected for. If they don't survive, are they going to be able to procreate, make any babies? No. The ones that do survive will be able to. And over time, the adaptations that were in the animals that survived will become the traits that are in the majority of the population. Because there's just no other genes that have been passed down. So the genes that were in the ones that survived get passed down to the rest of the population. Because everyone else died.
Like deer was more susceptible to infection, then they're most likely to die off, and the ones that aren't pass down a trait.
That makes them less susceptible to infection. So that means over 10 generations, most of the population of deer will be less susceptible to infection over time. Okay, I had one more. So in a nutshell, so this is a crow. I don't know why, but my last class for some reason assumed it was a seal. Okay, so it's a crow. These are beetles. This brown thing is supposed to be like a tree branch. Okay, so the crow can more easily see the green beetles. So the crow, when it's finding its food, finds the green beetles very easily. The orange beetles, even though they're less common at that point, survive because the crows can't find them, so they eat the green beetles. Over time, you can see that orange beetle becomes more common. The green beetles, a little bit less so. And then most of the green beetles get eaten. The only ones that have survived are the orange, so that's what the new population is. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Industrial Revolution. Okay. Basically, it's when we started using machinery and coal, a little bit of oil, not too much at that point, I don't think. This is the mid-1800s, where they really started, the trains started getting really popular. We started having tons of factories. We went from being an agriculture-based society to being a let's make stuff-based society, an urban-based society. Okay, does that ring a bell for the rest of you guys who are a little confused about the term Industrial Revolution? Okay. Does it make sense if I tell you that the Industrial Revolution ended up with a lot of pollution because all these factories were in cities and the cities basically had like a cloud of smoke that was completely over them all the time because the factories were always burning coal? Does that make sense? Okay, that's all you need to know. So basically in the mid-1800s in England, there was, I guess there had been for hundreds of years, this type of moth. The moth was either a gray or white for the most part. And there are a lot more white moths than gray moths because in London and in other places in the cities in England, they like to use a white stone to build their buildings. So when you use a white stone to build your buildings, if you're a gray moth, what's going to be easier to spot? The gray moth. So the gray moths got eaten more often, so there are less of them in the early 1800s. Once the Industrial Revolution started, what do you think happened to all those pretty shiny white buildings? They got dirty. And if you go to Edinburgh in Scotland, you'll still see them. They look filthy. My husband and I, our first reaction upon arriving in Edinburgh was, oh my God, it's so dirty. And then we realized, oh no, that dirt is like 150 years old. That's actually kind of cool. So, all right. So, over time, what do you think ended up happening to those white moths as these white buildings got sootier and sootier? It was easier for the white moths to be seen. So after the Industrial Revolution, what kind of moth do you think was more common, the gray or the white? The gray, because the gray could hide. The white really couldn't. So over time, there weren't that many predators, so it kind of balanced. This, what you're seeing here, is exactly what happened there. So this is new. You do not need to know for this class biology at ESUMS, divergent evolution. It's just a way of talking about it. But you need to know homologous trait. And that's when organisms share a trait due to common ancestry, it's called a homologous trait. So, like if you and your cousin both have brown hair because your grandmother has brown hair, or your grandfather has brown hair, and you share those grandparents, that would be homologous between the two of you because you got that trait from a grandparent, from a shared ancestor. Does that make sense a little bit there? Okay, so organisms can look very different, meaning the species diverge. They split apart and still have many homologous traits. Or even further back, it completely depends. So if we're talking homologous traits, we're talking evolution usually, but we can make the connection as like you and your cousin have the same shaped nose as your grandparent, sort of thing. That would be homologous between the two of you. Whereas if you and your friend who aren't related have the same kind of nose, that wouldn't be homologous. That's just a coincidence. Basically, homologous just means you have the same ancestor with that trait. So, like, let's say, ready? Can I keep going? Okay. So, examples. If we look at backbones, all vertebrate animals have backbones. That's what vertebrate means. It means you have a backbone. So we all have backbones because the ancestor of all vertebrates had a backbone and passed that on to everybody. So, okay, it must have been a good adaptation because nature allowed it to be passed down to many offspring. So having a backbone, a spine, in this case, must have been advantageous. So if you look at, let's say, the spine of a dog and the spine of a human, would that be homologous? Yeah, because it's from a common ancestor all the way back. Okay? They might look a little different, but they're the same. No, it's okay. And even if we talk about like a human backbone and a shark backbone, homologous or analogous? Homologous. You guys don't know what analogous is yet. We'll get there. That's next.
Analogous, I think, is like a trait that.
You should know it from 7th grade, but not quite this year. Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there. Let's look at these. So here we have wild mustard, which is basically the wild plant. Now, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, and kohlrabi all come from this one plant. Humans kind of bred this plant into all these different shapes. Now, that said, one thing that each of these different plants kept is that when they sprout flowers, this is what the flowers look like. That would be homologous. The fact that their flowers are all tiny and yellow and kind of sprout straight up from the plant. Okay, broccoli plants literally go from being a little bit taller than this projector when they are ready to be harvested. If you don't harvest them, you let them go, they shoot up about 3 feet and have a bunch of flowers like this on the end that eventually turn into seeds. It's the same with the rest of these, except Brussels sprouts are a little taller. We have here, yes, you should. So we have these dark brown bones all correspond to the same one in an ancestor. Light tan, again, same bones in an ancestor. You can see the bat and the horse both have the radius in the ulna. That's what allows you to do this. You see how you can kind of rotate your elbow around? That's because you have 2 bones in your lower arm that kind of twist around each other. Horses and bats only have the one because the ulna merged in with the other ones. Yep, cat and humans are very similar. The bird, it's a little bit further apart because you can see the wrist bones are pretty much gone. Whale is also really, really similar to the cat and the human. It's just everything's squished. Okay, so what do you think are the two most closely related of this bunch? What would be your guess? Human and cat, okay? So human, cat, whale, those are probably all pretty similar. Actually, whale and horse, though, are closely related as well. They just changed. And the structures are no longer homologous between them. So over time, it just changed. But anyway, what? Yeah, it's whale fin. Okay, then there's convergent evolution. Again, you don't really need to know that term. You need to know analogous. So traits that are similar due to reasons other than relatedness are called analogous traits. It's basically when you have the same trait for no other reason than besides it's coincidence. Bats and birds developed flying at completely different times. So even though their bone structure is somewhat kind of sort of similar, their wings are analogous. It's just a coincidence that they both came across this solution to some problem that they were having.
Isn't that the same as squid eyes?
Octopus eyes. We're going to get there.
Because I remember that for some reason.
Yep. So the process of the traits evolving is known as convergent evolution. That means they separated for a little while and they came back together. So these traits are from random chance. They just randomly happen to be the same. Or because unrelated organisms have adapted to similar environments. So if you have, let's say, a predecessor to a cactus ends up having to adapt to a desert environment, then the two completely unrelated cactuses might look very similar. Yeah, so they come across the same solution to their problem. So here is our two eye examples. Right here we have a human eye. Here we have an octopus eye. This is the structure of a human eye, structure of an octopus eye. But overall, very similar structure. Would you guys agree? Yeah. So is it because we're related to an octopus that we both have eyes, or is it just a coincidence? So homologous or analogous? Analogous. Good. Okay, here. The fact that bats and birds both have wings, is that because of homologous or analogous structure? Analogous. The structure of the bones in the wing, homologous or analogous? Homologous. Okay? Does that make sense, that separation there? Okay, so bats developed wings a lot later than birds did. So they didn't develop them because they have a common ancestor. So they don't have a common ancestor that flew. So they each developed them later on down the line on their own. Mammals, when birds were developing wings, which were essentially like little dinosaur velociraptor sort of things. Velociraptors were only the size of turkeys. When birds had feathers, birds were done. Dinosaurs evolved into birds over time. And so most dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is the end of the dinosaurs that were predators, had some sort of feathers. Even like T-Rex and Allosaurus now they're finding probably had feathers. So imagine a giant feathered creature running at you instead of, what you saw in Jurassic Park. It kind of adds a whole level of humor to the issue now. But anyway, so, and they don't have feathers still. It's appalling. Okay, so, the movie? Oh, yeah. Still no feathers. It's just, I won't go see it until they have feathers. Okay, so then an insect wing, is it homologous or analogous? Analogous with all of it. Separate. Okay, here we have two cacti. One is in a desert in Asia. One's in a desert here in Arizona. Homologous or analogous? What do you think? So over the course of millions of years, the climate in different areas will change significantly. Okay? So, analogous. Very good. It's a complete coincidence that these two look the same. Okay, placentals. Those are animals, basically, they're not mammal. Well, mammals are placentals, but not all placentals are mammals. But basically, placentals are anything that has a placenta. It's what feeds the kid, basically. Okay, when they're in utero. So marsupials are like kangaroos. They have a little pocket instead. All right, kangaroos or possums are marsupials. You know how kangaroos kind of grow their young in that little pocket on the front? Okay. All of these do the same thing. I'm calling it a pocket. It's really it's like a separate, yeah, it's like a pouch. It's for them to grow in. Yeah. Okay. So, the so do you guys think that the similarities between all these creatures is because they share a common ancestor or because it's a coincidence? That's a flying phalanger. So you guys think a flying squirrel, flying phalanger are closely related? Yes or no? Marsupials and placentals are actually pretty far apart relatively on the mammal tree. So all of these are analogous. And they live in pretty different environments for the most part too. Especially these two at the bottom. Alright, so I want you guys to look at your do now and answer questions 4 and 5, please. I want you to worry most about analogous versus homologous and not about convergent and divergent. We're going to keep going here. So, sometimes homologous structures have no further purpose. Once that happens, these structures are known as vestigial structures. So an example of that would be hips in whales and hips in snakes, that sort of thing. They just kind of get smaller and smaller because they're no longer in use. There's no advantage for them having hips anymore for whales. It's the baleen. It's a filter, basically to catch the particles in that they then swallow, like plankton. Okay, so please make sure you know vestigial structures. I can tell you 100%. There will be at least one question on that on the midterm. Yep. So basically those are things that have no further purpose. They were inherited from an ancestor, but they're no longer used. A common example that we're given in humans is the appendix. Okay. So yes, they have recently found a reason for it, but in modern society, most people in first world countries don't really need it. What? It's a bacteria storage. So like if your digestive tract ever gets cleared out for some reason, like you get sick in that sort of way, your gut bacteria will be restored by your appendix. But now that, that's not a regular basis sort of thing that happens, we don't really have to worry about it as much. Okay. Now we're going to just quickly look at what happens when humans get involved. We're going to look at selective breeding and genetic modification. Selective breeding is how we took wolves to be into being dogs. It's how we took grass into being corn and wheat and cotton and basically everything else. We basically took weeds, naturally growing grasses, and turned them into plants for our own use. So when you're selectively breeding, you're literally just taking two organisms with desirable traits. So like let's say two dogs with both of which have traits you want in a puppy, and you're just mating them together and hoping that those traits are passed down. What? It depends how you do it. Of course. Yeah. But I mean, even like, let's say if you are looking like to pick like a husband or wife, you're not really aware of it, but in your head, you're in like your subconscious, you're actually picking somebody who you think would be a good match to have the strongest offspring. And they've done tons of studies that have shown all sorts of like weird things, like the person you're most attracted to probably has an opposite immune system as you, so your child will have a stronger immune system, sort of thing. It's kind of cool. See, this chart just kind of shows like we took the gray wolf, manipulated it like crazy. So like, let's say we wanted to make this fluffy white guy. We took 2 friendly gray wolves. They probably had a little bit of extra fur than average, and kept, breeding those with the furriest, fuzziest wolves available until we ended up with something super fuzzy. Okay? To make the shorter-haired ones, we probably took shorter-haired wolves and just kind of bred the shortest-haired ones we could find together until we ended up with the shortest-haired ones.
Wait.
Yes, apparently. But these are just segments of a population. Most of the dogs you see in North America are actually European-based for the majority. But, yeah. All right, and genetic modification. That's going into an organism's DNA and literally changing it by replacing sections. That is the only way you end up knowing exactly what you're going to get. Selective breeding, you're mating together 2 animals and hoping for the best. With genetic modification, you only do this with plants, is you're literally taking a section of DNA out and putting a new one in that you like better. Yes, you're recoding the DNA. They do that. They have been doing it. And let me show you this next slide. So, what? No, just to plants and bacteria. Okay. Ready? So, a lot of the pictures kind of, when you search genetic modification, come out to be like people sticking a needle in a tomato, and that's just not how it works. Okay, so I just put these pictures on here. You don't really need to know that. Just know, like, they take out a chunk of bacteria, replace it, or they add a chunk of bacteria in, or they just take out a chunk of bacteria and kind of put it back together. Okay. Yeah. So genetically modified organisms have been a very political topic for the past decade. This is because GMOs are crops, like corn and tomatoes, that have been genetically modified to increase production. So, like, I'm drinking chamomile mint tea right now. Both of those have probably been genetically modified in some way, shape, or form to make the crop hardier. So you should know this. I highly, highly suggest you know this. Okay? Okay? That's why I'm not letting you pack up yet, because I really, really suggest you know this. Okay?
I just realized that.
I know. That's why I'm like, let's go. Okay, so what they'll add are things like insect resistance, herbicide resistance. Some of you might have heard of Roundup Ready soybeans. Roundup is an herbicide. It kills weeds. So you can spray that all over your crops, and your crops will live, the weeds will die. Of course, they're finding problems with that now because now all the weeds are becoming resistant to Roundup, which anybody could have predicted. But anywho, so like you can make them more resistant to cold. You can make your strawberries larger. That's a lot of what they've done. You can get different ways of helping during droughts. You can make your plants more resistant to water loss. They hold on to their water better. And at this point, most of the foods you eat that are more common, your tomatoes, your wheat, your soy, your corn, okay? Some fruit, not all, have been genetically modified in some way, shape, or form. And despite this, there's been tons and tons of research being done by every country across the globe. No research has been conclusive on whether or not there's any harm that comes from genetically modified organisms. There's nothing so far to show that it should be something we're concerned with. But, you know, we also didn't know that cigarettes were dangerous for like over 100 years. So, you know, that didn't come out until like the early to late 50s. Yay. You could try and speed up growth, yes.